Hello, this is Gary Auden, and this is an EDUcast titled Change the Conversation, Improve the Outcome, sponsored by NVT Fibridge and Telecom Reseller. One of the points we want to make today is that we're talking about the change of the conversation, improve the outcome when you modernize to IP networks. Did you know that by 2020, the amount of internet connected things will reach 50 billion and will account for 19 billion in profits and cost savings over the next decade? The question we have to sort of deal with in this conversation today is your network ready for the next generation of connected devices? Okay, today we have John Croce, CEO of NVT Fibridge, and I'm Gary Auden. And as we always do, we discuss our agenda. And part of our agenda is the digital transformation that's happening in communications and networks. But there are a number of barriers when you move to IP. You need to go through some upgrades to make that work. But we're finding that there are modern land principles that are different than we established maybe 20 years ago. We're going to discuss the design, the success stories of modern design, and how those success stories deliver to the client. So today, for digital transformation, John, I understand many organizations are still relying on outdated TDM phones and analog security devices. Does this reliance influence digital transformation?
Yeah, it does, in that a lot of these endpoints are still TDM or analog because of one of the big challenges associated with modernizing to an IP endpoint. However, those organizations will be forced to make that change because many of the manufacturers are end of support or end of lifing those outdated solutions. And there's a significant opportunity given, there's 200 million TDM phones, and the forecast for the modernization to IP-based surveillance cameras is also very healthy. And we also see the movement of smart city, where a lot of the IP enabling cities is a big market opportunity as well.
Now, when we go to the next slide, it's an interesting question here is, why are so many organizations still relying on these technologies? Is that because it's expensive, or capitalization, or complexity?
Well, I think it's a combination of many things. The three that you mentioned are definitely top of the list, but the number one barrier tends to be for organizations connecting that new IP endpoint back to the network is one of the biggest barriers, if not the biggest barriers. The cost, disruption, and risk to the business is a big concern, which then, as a result of the amount of money you spend on infrastructure, it makes the ROI challenging.
You have a statement on this page called "Stop the Insanity." What do you mean by that?
Well, the insanity is it's the quote from Albert Einstein. He defines insanity as doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And the stop the insanity is really around taking a new and fresh approach. And other quotes he has is, you can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created the problem. Is again the importance of considering a fresh approach. And a third quote that I like to mention is, the only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. And this is very prevalent in today's world of digital transformation because, again, education is based on best practices of the past and what we've learned from the past. Whereas what we talk about in this whole digital transformation is around learning new and better ways to conduct our business and ourselves.
Yeah, the next slide, we have the word traditional. What do we need to do to improve the outcome when we're doing this change in our networks and infrastructures?
So when we look at the whole idea of connecting an endpoint back to the switch fabric. In 1990, Calpana, a company, introduced the first multi-port Ethernet switch in the world. And in 94, Cisco acquired that company. And of course, for the first 15 years, the only devices connected to that multi-port data switch were data terminals. And the focus was all about how do I get bandwidth to those endpoints and improving bandwidth capabilities. But the last 15 years, with the introduction of things like IP phones and now everything else being IP, including cameras and access points, again, the mentality of how do I connect that endpoint was from a switch capability out, with little regard to the characteristics of the endpoint. Given that strategy or that mindset of the way in which you design your network, it resulted in many challenges for customers, including higher network costs, complexity, cybersecurity, long deployment cycles, and many of these points illustrated in this slide. So you have a lot of challenges associated with moving to the Internet of Things or the digital transformation, all around using an outdated process of connecting endpoints back to the network switch.
What you've been talking about is how people do things the way they've always done them. But I think there's another important question here. There's been an impact on the industry participant. What has that been?
Absolutely. This whole process of connecting these new endpoints have caused a lot of challenges for the industry participants. Longer sales cycles, more complexity, competition, because in many situations, those who provide the voice solution or the surveillance solution is depending on the network to deliver a good experience. But in many cases, the network is managed by a competitor. So it makes it real challenging, and you end up with finger pointing and potential frustrations of the customer, not knowing exactly who is responsible for delivering the needed services. So you also have challenges around day two support, demand on skill set, and also potential brand risk as well.
You mentioned the word challenges. Can you tell us where these challenges are coming from, what's stimulating them?
Yeah, it's really around the new IP endpoints organizations are looking to deploy. And the question is how do I connect that endpoint back to the application in the most effective manner? And of course, traditional thinking has you immediately thinking, all right, I need to use my traditional switches and rip and replace the infrastructure, create a new backbone to support those endpoints. So the costs associated with new cabling, IDF closets, because now you're introducing new PoE requirements. So that's cooling power, backup power, disruption to the business, the scheduling. And then once the solution's deployed is understanding the impact on staff and demands on your teams as well as demands on the network and ensuring that it doesn't impact your core business. So those are a lot of the challenges associated with this traditional thought of layering every single device on the same PoE backbone, supporting the core business.
We've talked about challenges, but you also talk about modern LAN principles. How do we have to change the conversation to deal with and work with modern LAN principles?
Well, yeah, modern LAN principles actually it came from Frost & Sullivan, and they introduced the whole idea of a new, fresh approach that expands traditional LAN thinking to incorporate these new Internet of Things devices. And that modern LAN approach has a set of principles. What they did is they researched multiple companies that took a fresh and different approach and that had great success in modernizing to IP. And they compiled this through this white paper and these new principles.
How do we learn more about the modern LAN principles as proposed by Frost & Sullivan?
I would recommend going to www.themodernlan.org and watching the introductory video by Frost & Sullivan that introduced the whole concept of modern LAN principles and reviews the principles themselves.
So let's talk about those. What are the modern LAN principles promoted by Frost & Sullivan?
Well, the first one and the most important is start with the endpoint requirements first. Instead of looking at the switch capabilities and whether it's a gigabit port, is really understanding the endpoint and the impact on the network. For example, if you look at an IP phone, IP phone does not require a gigabit path. It has maybe 100K of bandwidth requirements. But what's really important is the availability of bandwidth, uninterrupted bandwidth, because you can't, if you can't understand someone on the other end of the phone, the conversation stops. So it's really looking at the endpoint, its impact on the network, and its impact on your business first. Then building a sustainable LAN strategy, meaning making sure you look at future LAN considerations and the impact on devices today. I'll give you another example. If you look at that same IP phone, the IP phone design has a port off of the back of the phone to connect your data device. Well, there was over 150 million IP phones sold with a 10100 data port off the back for that data device. Now, if a customer is looking at establishing a gigabit path for the data requirements, that phone is no longer effective. They need to change that phone out to support the gigabit pass-through requirement for the data device. So building a sustainable LAN is looking at, given I'm looking to put this IP device on my network today, to the extent I have to change my network or change the endpoint, what is the future requirements? And am I building a network that is sustainable? Obviously, the third is then security and environmentally responsible. This is an important one because, again, as we transition to the new IP world, are we considering the impact on our environments as we move over? And then the fourth is maximize your ROI. I always pay attention to, are there things we can do as it relates to LAN readiness and network requirements to help maximize the return on investment of the overall project? And the last and foundational is leverage innovation. And that is leverage new innovations that allow customers to modernize and build a network to support the Internet of Things.
One of those innovations that I think we should focus on is the power over Ethernet, how that's revolutionizing LAN design and for modernization to IP.
When you look at standard Ethernet switches for, the better part of 25 plus years, the focus has been on increasing bandwidth capability. But the standard and enterprise grade switches, the only difference being, the kind of feature set available. But what was constant across every PoE switch is the reach limitations of 100 meters or 328 feet, and the fact that it needed Cat5 or Cat6 cable or better, and leveraged all four pairs within that cable to support that connectivity. Whereas the innovations that have been introduced, and we were on the forefront of those innovations, NBT FiBridge introduced the first network switch in the world that delivered Ethernet PoE connectivity over a single pair of wire with 1200 foot reach. That's our polar solution, and that was designed for IP phones. And we introduced long reach PoE solutions. So whether it's coax infrastructure, single pair or multi-pair infrastructure, we can deliver power and Ethernet connectivity to over 6,000 feet.
That brings the word infrastructure to mind. Why is infrastructure then so important?
This is a cross-section of an organization with multiple floors and, of course, IDF closets, intermittent distributed frame closets on multiple floors because of the switch reach limitations. And then from those individual closets, you would go and connect the data terminals. And of course, complementing that core network were supporting networks, either whether it was a voice network, which was designed point-to-point, and the protection network, which is also designed point-to-point. And what's important about understanding that topology is it was purpose-built, meaning those applications being real-time based applications meant that the best topology is point-to-point, because now I have uninterrupted bandwidth availability for each and every one of those endpoints. So that's the traditional setup. So you had your voice setup with a point-to-point topology. You had your physical security setup with a point-to-point topology. And then, of course, you had your data switch fabric supporting your core business with this distributed topology where everyone shared the bandwidth available.
When I look at the next screen, the two networks looks almost identical. Uh, how are modern land principles applied now?
If we look at the left side, which is the IP phones, is we were able to leverage that existing voice infrastructure, and given the capabilities of the polar switch delivering PoE connectivity over a single pair of wire, which is that existing voice infrastructure, we're able to deploy IP phones, leveraging the infrastructure instead of ripping and replacing it. Same thing on the other side, whereas we leverage the coax or multi-pair UTP infrastructure, and we're able to leverage that existing infrastructure, and with the clear switch and flex switch, able to transform that point-to-point infrastructure and design a fully IP network. The beauty of this topology is now you've created these physically separate smart paths for your new IoT devices. But now with a single cable, the company or organization or those responsible could converge that network either on-premise with a single cable in a very controlled fashion, or in the cloud, depending on where that customer wants to converge their networks. By doing this, they're saving money, they're eliminating risk and disruption, and they're building a robust platform without impacting their core network or their operations.
We talk a lot about return on investment, and I notice on the screen here, you're saying the way you do modern land changes the way you actually budget and produce investment dollars that can be used other places.
There's three components. There's to a successful IP modernization project. There's the infrastructure, the devices, and the applications. Now, when you break down infrastructure, there's the physical gear, being the backup power, the PoE switches. There's the cable costs associated with having to put new cable, and of course there's labor costs associated with that. And unfortunately, that is the first step of the project. So given there's so many unknowns to that part of the project, in many cases, customers underestimate that part of the project, meaning that they're taking dollars available, budget dollars available for that which drives the return on investment away from those other areas, like being the devices and the applications. Whereas when you look at modern land principles, if you're able to leverage the innovations that exist, as well as leverage your proven existing infrastructure, we can see a major reduction in infrastructure costs. Customers that have leveraged these principles and leveraged our technology, saving between 50 and 80% in infrastructure costs, which means that they can take that free up that budget and leverage it to that which drives a much better ROI, which is in the applications as well as the IP devices themselves.
You know, we're talking about really great ideas, but I think what's important is getting to know people and organizations that actually make a success out of this. New Mexico State University was one of your first organizations to pioneer modern land thinking. Would you tell us their story?
Yeah, actually, good point. This is one customer that Frost & Sullivan did interview and discuss things with and came up with these principles. But they had a major overhaul of their IP phones. Initially, they started thinking the traditional way of ripping and replacing infrastructure. Quickly came to realize that it was an incredibly expensive proposition, and they challenged their provider to find a better way. And the provider then introduced our solution to the polar switch to this opportunity. New Mexico State University thought it was too good to be true, so what they did was a proof of concept, and they recognized quickly that this would allow them to accelerate their IP modernization and save them a lot of money. They actually went as far as doing a bake-off of a similar sized location in their library and another facility using traditional methods and using the polar. And what they found was that they were able to do the polar in their library area in less than a day, whereas the other location took 3 weeks. So they quickly realized that this was the way to modernize, and they basically deployed over 7,000 phones leveraging the polar innovation, saved $1 million money, as well as accelerated their deployment by 3 years and prevented 21 tons of cable e-waste by leveraging that infrastructure.
Let's move on to a completely different place, a U.S. federal government agency that used your solution.
Yeah, so this is the most powerful U.S. federal agency in the world. I guess you can know who that is, but they much the same situation. You can appreciate in these federal buildings the cost of having to rip and replace infrastructure, as well as business disruption. But again, introduced to the Polar Switch, did a proof of concept, and recognized the value, and result was an amazing transition to IP, where there's IP phones located on everyone's desk and in every location in this agency.
Yeah, the first two we just talked about are sort of traditional ideas. This one fascinated me, bringing it into retail, which most people don't even think about.
Yeah, absolutely. This was Il Corte Inglés in Spain, actually. 100 retail locations. They were looking to modernize their physical security, their IP cameras to IP cameras, and of course had major challenges in having to rip and replace their coax. So they were introduced to our Clear 24 switch, which is the first 24-port managed Ethernet over coax solution in the world, and we were able to do a successful proof of concept in one of their stores. And the beauty is that we have this adapter, this one endpoint adapter, where it takes a single coax cable that can go up to 6,000 feet, and they can convert that to 4 separate endpoints. So it's one coax cable to 4 Ethernet ports on the other side. It's like a mini 4-port switch, delivering PoE to each of the 4 endpoints. So they were able to not only go and replace an existing analog camera, but take that single long run of coax and now be able to position 4 IP cameras where there was only 1 camera before on that same infrastructure. So they found that incredibly useful to expand their capabilities, their security capabilities. So they've been deploying all 100 retail locations using our Clear Switch. And again, because of the point-to-point topology that they're leveraging, every single store is exactly the same. So they have a repeatable, predictable, and scalable methodology to deploying every single one of their stores. So from an operational perspective, it's incredibly beneficial, but also it allowed them so far to save over $3 million, as well as save valuable space, because they didn't have to go and create IDF closets throughout their retail stores.
I think what you've been saying with the 3 examples is you have to think somewhat outside the box. What are you doing to replicate this success with other organizations? And what does the $100 million mean at the bottom of the screen?
Well, one thing as an organization that we're incredibly proud of is the fact that we've been introducing this innovation for over a decade now, and we have helped customers collectively save in excess of $100 million in infrastructure costs. So we're looking to accelerate the next $100 million of savings that we can help customers create. And what we're doing is we're offering customers a no obligation proof of concept. I know, for those going or considering digital transformations, especially mid to large size organizations, it's daunting tasks and a lot of risk when you're thinking traditional rip and replace. And when we come across with our story, it sounds too good to be true. And every one of the success stories I shared with you today all started with a no obligation proof of concept that allowed them to prove out the technology in their environment, which allowed them then to eliminate risk. And we are encouraging customers to leverage that proof of concept. We also have additional discounts that we're offering if we register projects with us, where we can offer additional discounts of up to 20% in savings.
You said contact. You hear some contact information, phone number, email address, website, and the like for contacting Fibridge. Some more resources to look up Modern LAN and talk about the success stories. And I'd like to thank you, John, for today's conversations. Very enlightening.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share our story with you. It was much appreciated.